From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello. I'd like to thank you for attending this event. We have two special guests here with us today. They truly don't need an introduction, but I will do my best to make a quick introduction. With us is Congresswoman Anna Eshoo. Congresswoman Anna Eshoo from California. She has been a true advocate of the Assyrians. Anytime our community has needed something, anytime there's been a help, she's always been the first door we've knocked on. She has worked tirelessly for our community, and we can't begin to thank her enough for everything that she's done. I'd like to invite Mr. Carlo Genja up here for a second with me, please. Congresswoman Eshoo, if you would mind stepping up here with us for 1 second, we'd like to present you with a plaque to show our appreciation for all of the wonderful work that you've done to our community. Mr. Carlo Genja, Congressman Eshoo.
Isn't that beautiful? Do you want to say something, Carlo? No. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful? Do you want to take a picture of the camera? Wonderful. Start speaking now? Okay. Thank you. Isn't that beautiful? I'm going to put this here so you can get a close-up shot of it. Shalom Aleichem. Avitam Rabba Basima. I never thought that I would be at the Library of Congress and speaking Assyrian. So this is really wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. It's always a special privilege to walk across the street from the House of Representatives and the capital of the United States to the Library of Congress. Every time I do, I marvel at the thinking of our framers and Thomas Jefferson. Imagine that he said the Congress of the United States should have its own library. And today, this is the largest repository of knowledge in the entire world. And I think it's really fitting for this meeting to be taking place at the Library of Congress because Assyrians have not only a culture and a heritage that is rich, but it dates back to the origins of civilization and what they as a people brought forward. So we are the descendants of that heritage and that history. I want to thank Dr. Mary Jane Deeb, who's the Chief of African and Middle Eastern, the division here at the Library of Congress. I don't see her, but I want to acknowledge her role in this, and of course, for this meeting to be open to the public and Assyrian legacy from ancient civilization to modern cultural revival. It's extra special. It's not only special for me to be here with you today, but it's extra special that my colleague and brother friend, Congressman Frank Wolf, is here with us today. He has been a giant in the Congress for human rights. He has been a force to reckon with, regardless of the administration, regardless of the politics of anything. He has a voice that really, when he speaks, his magnificent voice echoes around the world. And oppressed people know the name Frank Wolf. So Frank, thank you. I miss you in the Congress, but I know that your magnificent work continues. Let me just say a few words about the work that Congressman Wolf and I did together relative to our people. Back in 2008, we came together and decided that there needed to be a vehicle recognized in the House. And so we created a caucus that's called the Religious Minorities in the Middle East Caucus. And we had at least two goals in mind. First of all, we knew that members of Congress needed to be educated. They knew very little or nothing, and this is not fault or blame, they just didn't know. They didn't understand. Some were even surprised, hold on to your seats or your hats, that there were Christians in the Middle East. Imagine that. And one of my favorite responses was, "Where do you think Jesus was born?" Trenton, New Jersey. So that was one of our goals, but also to deepen and broaden their appreciation of the ancient cultures in the Middle East and why they deserve our support in the Congress, and the nexus between the values of America that would drive us to do that. Clearly, there's a nexus between them. Now, we only had a few members to begin with, but we kept working. I think two of the most important accomplishments, and I want to acknowledge again Congressman Wolf's just fearlessness and insistence that we would secure $10 million in 2010 to fund programs that would protect Iraq's religious minorities. And secondly, we passed legislation, and it really was at his insistence, to create a special envoy for religious minorities in the Middle East. I remember Frank saying to me, "Anna, if there's not a point person that is a high level, then we're just going to drift from one person to another within the State Department." How right he was about that. So I think that we've come a long way. The caucus has grown now to over 50 active members, and we've advanced, I think, very recently, a historic achievement. On March 14th of this year, the United States House of Representatives voted 393 to 0. So it was unanimous. Every member that was on the floor to vote voted for the resolution that Congressman Jeff Fortenberry and myself were the sponsors of. He is now he has taken Frank's place as the co-chair of the caucus. Now, why is this historic? This is only the second time in the history of the United States of America that, as a genocide is taking place, that we would place that definition on what is occurring. The other was Rwanda. And it defines the persecution of Christians, obviously Assyrians, because we are Christian, Chaldeans, Syriacs, Yazidis, and other ethnic and religious minorities in Iraq and Syria. 3 days later, imagine this, Frank, the State Department, I think, took a historic step as well by asserting that the persecution of Christians, Yazidis, and by ISIS is, in fact, a genocide. In a powerful and I think really poignant speech, the Secretary of State stated, quote, "The fact that Daesh just kills Christians because they are Christians, Yazidis because they are Yazidis, Shia because they are Shia. In its entire worldview, it's based on eliminating those who do not subscribe to its perverse ideology. There is no question in my mind that if Daesh succeeded in establishing its so-called caliphate, it would seek to destroy what remains of ethnic and the religious mosaic which once thrived in the region." And as I said, it's only the second time in the history of the United States of America that such a designation the designation has been placed. But we still have an enormous amount of work to do. Today, June 10th, marks the second anniversary of the invasion of Mosul, when 500,000 people fled for their lives. Some didn't make it, and we know what happened to them. Overnight, we saw the systematic extermination of the world's oldest Christian communities by ISIS, and of course, they haven't stopped. They continue to ravage Iraq and Syria's religious and ethnic minorities. Men and boys are being killed, women and girls are being abducted, sold, raped. So a genocide designation by the United States is an important step, but it's only one step. I work daily with my colleagues, both from the caucus and from across the House of Representatives. This is a nonpartisan issue. This is not Republican, Democrat. We never treated it that way. It should not be treated that way because we need to attract as much support as we can. We're working on a daily basis to continue to secure humanitarian aid. We work to bring about security and an expedited pathway to refugee status for the besieged ethnic and religious minorities in Iraq and Syria who are just suffering so immensely that there are not adjectives, I think, that fit the word suffering. We also continue to assist USAID partners in reaching the displaced populations, and Assyrians are so much a part of that reside outside of the refugee camps. And we know very especially that that describes the Assyrians and a majority, obviously, of those that are afraid to be in the camps mixed with others because of a long and troubled history. We're also working very hard to see that as the areas that are liberated, that the Kurdish regional government and the Iraqi government not only honor the return for those that were forced to flee, but also to have a safe haven. Because, well, for all of the reasons that you already know. In so many ways, I'm preaching to the choir here because you are the scholars and the knowledge base of all of these issues. So I want to thank you for inviting me to be here today. I'm very proud that our history is being placed front and center at an institution that is the greatest repository of information in the world. This is the appropriate place for not only my people, but for those that have come to learn about our culture to be. And I want to thank you for the recognition from the Assyrian Alliance, the Assyrian Universal Alliance America. And I also want to end on this note of once again paying tribute to my magnificent colleague, a man of such great integrity, of faith, of a voice that has such clarity, and it comes from such a deep place in him. When members of Congress leave the Congress, most are interested in going off and making a lot of money. Because when you're in public service, you don't go into public service for money. That's not what it's about. But he has a continuum of his work, of what he did in the Congress and what he is doing now. So, Frank, bless you. Bless you. I know God has blessed you with your magnificent family and 16 grandchildren that he was talking about. So with that, I wish I could stay longer, but it's Friday. I have to get out to Dulles. The lines are excruciatingly long. It's not a good day to travel, but I need to get back to my constituents in California, and I don't want to miss the flight. So thank you. God bless all of you, and thank you to the organizations and everyone that's here today, including the Library of Congress. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.
Congresswoman Anaisha, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to take this opportunity now to introduce Congressman Wolf. Congressman Wolf, throughout his career in Congress, was an advocate of human rights, and that did not stop once he retired from Congress. In fact, Congressman Wolf went to Iraq, if I'm not mistaken, after he had retired from Congress, to go see firsthand what was happening to the Syrian community. So I'd like to again ask Mr. Carlo Genge to join me on the stage. And I would like to ask Congressman Wolf, on the stage we have a appreciation plaque for you as well, for all the service that you've done, not just for our community, but for all communities that are facing persecution. Thank you again, Congressman.
Well, thank you very much. They want us to get together.
Yes.
There you go. Great. Well, thank you very much, and it was good to see Anna. I don't see her as much as I used to, and she's one of my favorite people. So it was a treasure just to be here to see her. I think Anna said a lot of things that I was going to say, so I'm going to try to take it from really what Anna said to some ideas and some thoughts. I want to begin by saying, the Bible says much about this, and Jesus says much about this. In Ecclesiastes 4, it said, "Again I looked, I saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they had no comfort. The power was on the side of their oppressors." And Jesus in Luke 4 talks about the oppressed. In the situations out in the region, Paul would have a very difficult time traveling to Damascus, to Straight Street now, the only street mentioned in the Bible. And in Iraq, we all know, and many of you know as much as anything, so I'm not going to get into detail. I remember my first trip to Iraq. We were in Nasiriyah when the war broke out, and the administration wouldn't let me go. We kind of came in from Kuwait, and we were in this little town. I showed my ID to the soldier, and I said, "I'm a member of Congress." And he said, "Oh, come on in." He said, "You know where we are?" I said, "It's Nasiriyah on my map." He said, "No, this is Ur." And it took me to a ziggurat. Many of you may have been there. And I climbed the ziggurat, 2200 BC. And there's a history. Abraham, Ezekiel is buried there. Daniel is buried there. When we were there last year, we were in El Kush, up almost in the front lines where the ISIS is. And we were in this little village again, and they kept saying, "Do you want to see the tomb? The tomb." And I said, "Sure." And they took me to Nahum's tomb. Nahum's buried there. I touched Nahum's tomb. The history in this region, in your region, is unbelievable. It's one that should wake up the church in the West. And I think one of the important things we need to do is to wake up the church in the West. I'm going to skip a lot of what I was going to say, but just tell you one story. We were there. We were in a little village, and they took us in to see a refugee. It was an old school, and it was a man who had been a construction worker. You could feel his hands. They were very, very rough. He had 2 children, and he told us a story. He said when ISIS came in, he lived a few miles outside of Mosul. ISIL came in and took over his village. He had a wife and 4 kids at that time. One daughter has since left to go to Turkey, and he has his son now living in San Diego. He said his wife had cancer, breast cancer. A lot of cancer runs in my family. So he said a few days after ISIS took over, he and his wife went to the hospital for his wife to get treated. He said the ISIS said they would not give her treatment unless she were to convert, unless she were to renounce her faith, unless she were to deny Jesus. He said they refused. His wife refused, and he refused. They went back to the little village, and she died several weeks later. I could not help thinking of that story because last November I was in Israel, and we went up to Capernaum. And in Capernaum, we went into this little church, which is above the house, Peter's house. And we went to the site where Peter walked on the water. The site where Peter gave the Beatitudes. And I kind of thought, here's Peter, who ate with Jesus, who saw Jesus do miracles, who saw Jesus walk on the water. And Peter denied Jesus 3 times. An Iraqi, Assyrian, Christian construction worker who never saw Jesus and his wife refused to deny Christ. And so the thought that these people are there and we in the West are forgetting about them. And so there are some things that I think that you could do, and I'm going to kind of move to really, because I don't want to leave you on a down note, except to tell you, though, just so I can electrify and alert you on something. The bill that Anna was so gracious to mention was a special envoy, which she played the major part in, to set up a special envoy to advocate for the persecuted church in Iraq, but also in Syria and in the Middle East. Knox Thames said the following the other day. He was in Rome. It says a U.S. governmental official visiting Rome on Monday said that as a result of the Islamic terrorist groups such as ISIS, the, quote, door for Christians in Iraq is closing, and the window of time to prevent their eradication is narrowing. And Knox said, I feel a sense of urgency because Christians are leaving. There were 1.5 million Christians in Iraq when the war began. I think, Phil, I'll get it. There were 1.5 million Christians in Iraq before the war began. Now, when we were there, we were told it's roughly 250,000. Bishop Werda said that roughly 17 Christian families leave every day. And the thought that we would have the Middle East, the cradle of Christendom, many of your relatives and relatives of far, far distance in the past, people who speak Aramaic, the same language as Jesus, the thought that they would be eradicated and removed from that region is painful. So what can be done? What should be done? And these are, again, my own personal opinions. Again, I think it's great that we passed, as Anna said, to call it genocide. My thing is, next step is what? We were able to convince the language, if you look at the CJS bill, that Congressman Culberson has language in order to prosecute ISIS people. They're going to look anyone who's joined ISIS to begin the prosecution. So we're having a group at the Justice Department to deal with that issue. Secondly, I urge you to urge members of Congress to go to the region and visit. When I was in Congress, we would go out, we would see, we would live in the camps, we would be with the people. You can't know about Iraq unless you see it and feel it and touch it and taste it, and not just get in there at 10 o'clock in the morning and leave before dark, but spend the night, listen to the people. So I urge you to urge members of Congress to go. Secondly, I urge you, always keep this as a bipartisan issue. But I urge you to join the Coptic Christians, who I was with yesterday, and the other groups, to meet with Secretary Clinton, the Democratic nominee, and Donald Trump, the Republican nominee. And do it before the election. Do it even before Labor Day if you can, to sit down and ask them to make this a priority, to speak on it. The presidency and people running for the presidency have great credibility, and when they speak, they have a loud microphone. You should ask Donald Trump and Secretary Clinton to speak out on this issue, but you should meet with them. Thirdly, I urge you to ask both political parties. I'm trying to get it done in my party, but both political parties to carry language on this issue in their platforms so that the American people and other members of Congress can see that this is such an important issue. Next, get new members in January and February, new members of Congress to become advocates. Before I got elected to Congress, I didn't know anything about this. I took a trip to Romania during the dark days of the Ceausescu administration and literally became electrified by seeing the persecution. Tried to adopt some new members of Congress to come and join and come along. And lastly, you need to wake up the church. The Pope has spoken out on this issue. Cardinal Dolan has spoken out on this issue. Cardinal Wuerl has spoken out on this issue. Russell Moore has spoken out on this issue. But few other members have. And here we have an issue that impacts on the faith community, and go back to look at words in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Look at passages in Proverbs. Look at the very fact this ought to be an issue that the church cares deeply about. And so the silence of the church, if you may remember, Dietrich Bonhoeffer spoke out against anti-Nazi activity. We should electrify and wake up the church. Now, in fairness to the church in the West, it may be because they do not know completely what is going on. But I urge you to wake up the church. And if we do these things, I think I believe honestly, we can turn this issue around. But time is short. And for the political process, the way to get the attention of people running for office is talk to them before the election, then ask the election. So talk to your members, meet with Trump, meet with Clinton, get it in the platform, get new members of Congress to come in, and lastly, wake up the church. And lastly, pray that God will move this nation to deal with this. I do not want to see on our watch, particularly those of us who are blessed to still be here in 5 years from now, where we will see literally the end of Christianity in the cradle of Christendom. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you for joining us for our last panel for the day, Assyrian Culture in the Middle East and Diaspora. Our first speaker, Fadi Dawood, is a research analyst, NATO Association of Canada. He is a historian of the modern Middle East with special focus on minority populations. He is taught in a number of universities in Canada and the United Kingdom. His PhD is from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, was on refugees, warriors, and minorities in Iraq, the case of the Assyrians, 1920 to 1933. He is co-editor of a forthcoming edited edition entitled State and Society in Iraq, Citizenship under Occupation, Dictatorship, and Democratization. So, Mr. Fadi Dawood.
Thank you. One second. There we go. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation, Dr. Nabi, everyone for organizing. This is actually a paper that I'm beginning to think about now on nationalisms, I should say, not only nationalism in the Middle East, and about the various nationalist ideologies that emerged in the period of the late Ottoman Empire into the formations of the modern state. So I am, in essence, contextualizing the Syrians, the Arab nationalists, the Kurdish nationalists, and other nationalist sort of policies into the larger context of political movements that emerged in the period. And I'm essentially arguing that nationalisms in the Middle East were, contrary to what literature says to us, were not movements for secularization. Rather, they were always rooted in ethno-religious nationalist ideologies, and they were combating the only reason that they emerged were, urban nationalists and urban elites were combating religious politicians and religious clergy for dominance in the region, or dominance of the political sphere in the region. In any case, without going too much, I will say that Assyrian nationalism emerged in the same time period and under similar circumstances as Arab, Kurdish, Turkish nationalism, amongst many, in the late Ottoman period following the Ottoman Tanzimat reforms. Educated urban elites were the ones originally responsible for thinking about ideas of ethnic and linguistic nationalism, and the same group of people were also responsible for other political and social movements that accompanied the rise of nationalist thought in the Middle East. Originally founded in Greater Syria, ideas of nationalism were theorized by intellectuals in Damascus and Beirut. Both Muslim and Christian intellectuals hoped that, for example, pan-Arab nationalism would unite members of the community against the central Ottoman state and create a united opposition to policies that they feared would infringe upon their place in urban life. Emerging Arab nationalists, for example, were not united in their root cause in adopting the idea. For example, in Beirut, Christian urban notables feared the pan-Islamist policies of the Ottoman state. Muslims, educated intellectuals in Beirut were concerned about the censorship policies of anti-constitutionalism promoted by the Ottoman Sultan at the time. Meanwhile, urban notables in Damascus feared for the increasing influence of European interests and as a form of controlling the populace. The political conditions that influenced and gave way to the rise of Arab nationalism were also present in areas of the Ottoman Empire where large Assyrian populations lived. Urban Assyrians, and in particular those living in Greater Syria, Turabdin and Urmia in Iran, were influenced by the political movements emerging in the region, where early Assyrian nationalists saw the marginalization of the community, both in the political and social spheres of the Ottoman Empire, as a reason to protect an identity that they saw as an integral to their language, religion, and unique cultural identity in the larger Ottoman milieu. As a result, members of the Assyrian community began to think of as a collective and on how they could preserve their identity within the shifting, unsettled political conditions in the hinterland of the empire. They published books, magazines, newspapers, and articles that discussed the history, identity, and most importantly, the national and ethnic origin of the Assyrian people. For example, in 1879, Assyrians of Diyarbakir, in what is now southern Turkey, established the ancient Suryoya Brotherhood, as well as establishing grammar schools, literary societies, and other organizations that helped to promote and educate Assyrians in their shared identity, history, and nationalist vision. Now, from this context, I argue that three sort of groups of people emerged fighting for leadership in the case of Iraq. And just these early nationalists, people like Naum Fayek and Fredena Turaya, were those individuals that actually started to theorize. And for the most part, they were urban intellectuals who actually had no background in tribal politics that actually plagued Assyrians at the time. Now, in 1915, the sort of the period between the rise of this nationalist ideology and the genocide that befell the Assyrian population, which I don't really have much time to get into at the moment, but I talk about it elsewhere, minority Christian populations were targeted, Armenians, Assyrians, Pontiac Greeks, by Kurdish irregulars and Ottomans alike, where it is hypothesized that about 50% of the population was massacred, which resulted in mass displacement of the population, where they were actually brought to what is called the Baquba refugee camp, which I actually talk about again in the forthcoming edited collection, so I encourage everyone to buy a copy, where these people were brought, and I argue that this space that they created in the refugee camp gave rise to three types of leaders: urban intellectuals, military generals and military warriors, and the third group are religious figures. And so this is a picture of the refugee camp for those that haven't seen it. So speaking of the case in Iraq, so fast forward a bit, after the genocide, they were brought to the Baquba refugee camp, and here we have a new sort of call for the rise of Assyrian nationalism. So the death of Marshal Mamoud in 1920, who was the figurehead of the Church of the East, and settlement of this community in Baquba brought various tribal groups into one space. The refugee camp provided a way for political ideas to be exchanged between members of the community without the obstacles of geographic separation. As a result, new ideas promoted by various political figures allowed members of the refugee population to become engaged in debates that continue to occupy the community, and particularly the urban elites or the urban intellectuals of those community for the remainder of the British Mandate in Iraq. Just as a side note, the British Mandate in Iraq was the period of colonial occupation that began in 1920, turned into a mandate under the auspices of the League of Nations in 1922, ending in 1932. As a result of these new ideas promoted by the various political figures, allowed members of the population to engage in debates about nationalism, identity, and politics. After the death of Marshal Mamoun, Surma Marshal Mamoun, who was the sister of the fallen Marshal Mamoun and the aunt of the new Marshal Mamoun, who was 10 years old or 11 years old when he became a religious leader, became politically responsible, or she thought that she had become politically responsible for the leadership of the Syrian community. She took it upon herself to promote the interests of the population to the British colonial government in Iraq with the aid of Anglican missionaries, while individuals like Agha Patras, who I have a picture of, I think this is Surma Shamoun and this is Agha Patras, Yusuf Malik, and others were some of the political figures who challenged the political role of the Marshal Mamoun family and the religious leadership at the time. The Syrians were not politically unified, so we have to actually say that. When we talk about nationalism, we're not talking about a unified group of people that understood what this nationalism meant. Nationalism meant different things for different individuals, depending on where they had emerged. The Syrians were not politically unified during the years of the British Mandate. Some prominent figures within the community, most prominently Yusuf Malik, called for the settlement of the Syrians outside of the borders of the Iraqi state. But Malik also argued that if the British were not going to fulfill their promise to the community by establishing an independent nation state for the population, he called for the settlement of the community in Iraq and for the recognition of their political and religious leadership as part of the political fabric of the Iraqi state. In essence, Malik argued that Assyrian religious office holders must be recognized as part of the organic law scheme of 1925 in Iraq, and he called for the appointment of non-religious Assyrians to the national government in Baghdad. Malik believed that this would encourage members of the refugee population to become more supportive of the ideas of settling in Iraq, and felt that these representatives would be able to protect the community from this hostile, or what he saw as the hostile, Arab officials in Baghdad. Malik was the only member of the Syrian community to voice his support for an inclusion of the refugees in the administrative structures of the state. As an Iraqi-born civil servant, he had worked with the British and Iraqi governments for the vast majority of the British Mandate, and he argued that the inclusion of members of the community in administrative structures of the state would compel the Iraqi government to accept the population within the political and social apparatuses of the state. Interestingly, he was born in Iraq, fluent in both Arabic and English. Malik was uniquely positioned to speak on behalf of the Syrian community. He emerged as part of this urban leadership that I discussed earlier, who had traditionally would have had no participation or no role in the internal politics of the community. Prior to the settlement of the refugees in Iraq, religious and tribal leaders were the only office holders of political authority in the Haikari Mountains. And Malik represented a new type of urban, educated, non-tribal elite. He became part of a powerful network of urban Assyrians in Iraq, Syria, the United States, and elsewhere in the diaspora, and worked to demonstrate that the community was not only able to manage its affairs without the help or the need of involvement of tribal leaders, but saw tribal authority as outdated, unable to manage the problems that faced the population in Iraq, which created a camp of these individuals separate from the rest of the leadership in the community. Now, at the same time, perhaps one of the biggest sort of achievements that we see in this period happen within this urban elite community is not only the publication of books and the promotion of these ideas, but I think the efforts that they made in order to bring together a hodgepodge of individuals from various churches. And they actually always spoke about this national identity under the auspices of the church. And they actually believed that the churches would be able to unite under the authority of one patriarch at some point in time. So to them, they saw this nationalist movement as a unification under an Assyrian religious identity, and not necessarily a secular one that literature would have us to believe. Military leaders also played an important role in shaping the leadership struggles in the period of the British Mandate in Iraq. Individuals like Al-Butras, who claimed that he had spent, and I find this an important anecdote, he spent 38,000 rupees. Iraq had used rupees as its currency as it was managed under the office of the India office at the time. 38,000 rupees during the 1921 on behalf of the Syrian refugees in Iraq. Butras claimed that he was acting in an official capacity. Again, all these people claimed that they were acting in the official capacity as democratic representatives of the Syrian people. On behalf of the Syrian refugee population in Iraq, Butras claimed that he was acting in an official and elected democratic capacity in order to save the population from the persistent threats posed by the Arab population in Baquba, and that the British and Iraqi governments had given him the authority to act on behalf of the refugees during the first few months of the British occupation in Iraq. Butras' campaign in this area continued until 1923 to 1924 period. Well, actually, he died just around that time, but the organization that he had built continued to act as a group of these military leaders. When he began a long correspondence with Winston Churchill, for example, and other British officials in London, the letters he sent sought the help of British individuals for the reimbursement of costs he had personally incurred in Iraq and France. Though the British refused to comply with these sort of challenges or this money, the return of the money, Butras and his allies used these claims and the correspondence with British government to demonstrate to the refugee population that he was not only a leader responsible for pursuing their interests in Iraq, they actually tried to show that the money he had spent personally, and according to his supporters, was intended to help the refugee population reoccupy villages they had lost a number of years earlier in the Haikari Mountains during the genocide. Agha Butras continues to occupy a very special place amongst what I call the pantheon of Assyrian military leaders. During and after the First World War, and thus in the collective memory of the Syrian community, both in Iraq and in the diaspora in North America and Europe. For example, a famous Assyrian singer and musician recorded an entire album dedicated to the memory of and heroic acts of Butras. The album recalls a time of political opportunity for the Syrian people when Butras tried to bring the population together under one political banner, but inflated egos and squabbling within the community led to the destruction of Butras' dream of salvaging what remained of the Syrian community after the First World War. In the same album, which is entitled Lion Hunter, in sort of reference to the ancient historical past that we heard about this morning, the singer links the memory of Butras to the heroic ancient Assyrian kings and leaders. The songs on the album highlight what are believed to be actions of a hero who led the Assyrians through the First World War and beyond, which actually cement this whole idea of the military leader within the Assyrian community. Now, the third individuals, or the third group of people, are the religious establishment. And the religious establishment, led by Surma Marshamoon, the aunt of Marshamoon, who I think is a very fascinating individual as a female at the time, was working with British missionaries and other individuals to demonstrate that the Assyrians were, in fact, not only reliant on her sort of family and on her religious, the religious followers, but rather they actually had always, quote unquote, traditionally lived under these auspices. And so in the Baquba refugee camp, she managed to assemble an area called the aristocratic area within the refugee camp, which I discussed elsewhere. And she actually managed to bring the bishops and tribal leaders under a tribal authority or a tribal committee to manage the affairs of the community inside this refugee camp, which actually made it much more difficult for individuals like Agha Petros and like those who I discussed, military and non-military elites, to actually combat her role in managing the population. The role played by Sirma and Agha Petros during the mandate split the leaders of the community, and indeed the community as a whole, into two political camps. Some believe that the refugee population would be best served if the religious establishment, and in particular the Marshamoun family, was politically marginalized. As part of a new military leadership, they were motivated by what they saw as the necessity for a new political structure headed by military or non-military elites, lobbying the British for a new state that would be governed by these elites in a democratically elected fashion. And the claims for leadership within the group were well received by some community members between 1922 and 1929, as the Syrians began to develop plans to rescue the community from the threats posed by the Iraqi and British governments. Now, I conclude that all these debates were debates within the sort of the educated elites and military elites of the community. The larger population, which was living as a refugee population, really did not care about these nationalist sort of squabblings. What they were really caring about is where they would be settled, how they would live, and essentially, live beyond subsistence living, regain some of their livelihoods, which was mainly based in farming and agriculture prior to the First World War. Now, I think that as a result of all these nationalist movements, and this is what I'm theorizing, we have strong military leaders emerging to take role as the supreme leader, as the savior of a nation, and the Syrians were no different from Arabs, Turks, and others. And yet, at the same time, the populace became sort of absorbed these ideas through propaganda, be it in the case of Arab nationalism in Iraq or Syria or Turkish nationalism in Turkey. In the case of the Syrians, it was different. It was the Semel massacre that cemented this nationalist idea. And the Semel massacre is a massacre in 1933 that actually brought the Syrians under attack from the Iraqi army, the newly independent Iraqi army, and some Kurdish irregulars that massacred much of the population in the Semel region in Iraq. And I think that moment really cemented these nationalist sort of debates into populist ideas and into the mainstream. Identities were really affected by what had emerged as nationalist ideas. And so I hope in the future to continue to debate this. As I said, this is a very early version of the paper. So I would love to hear some comments from everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dawood. Our next presenter is Alda Benyamin. She completed her PhD at University of Maryland in 2015 on Assyrians in modern Iraq, using archival sources in Baghdad, Mosul, Erbil, and Dahuk, in languages ranging from Arabic, Classical Syriac, and contemporary Syrian Aramaic. She's currently working on cultural heritage preservation at the University of Pennsylvania Museum and the Smithsonian Institute. Her most recent trip to Iraq was in May 2016.
Thank you all for being here. I want to especially thank Mary Jane Deeb and Dr. Eden Nabi for putting this wonderful conference together, and for the organizations that funded it, and for the Library of Congress, of course. My presentation will take you to the next 50 years after what Fadi just talked about, so you have the basis covered of the first World War I period and the first few decades within it. So between negotiation and resistance, Baghdadi Assyrian intellectuals from the 1970s and the 1980s. And I focus particularly on urban intellectuals, mainly in Baghdad, under the Ba'ath rule. So you have to put that in context, that the negotiation is happening is at a time when the state is really gaining in strength and influence. So they have to, so it has to be relatively sort of to that period. And let me just say a thing about the picture. I was just there a few weeks ago. This is Rabban Hurmus Monastery dating back from the 7th century in Al-Qush. It's one of the last villages standing right now in the Nineveh Plain region, and it still has 1,600 families, so it was really nice to be there and get to do some research. Okay, so today I will analyze the ways in which Assyrian intellectuals negotiated for political rights from a government growing in strength and influence in the early 1970s. This discussion is part of my monograph project, Negotiating the Place of Assyrians in Modern Iraq, which examines the relationship between a stronger Iraqi state under the Ba'ath regime, beginning in 1968, and the Assyrians. I study the role of the Assyrians in Iraq's leftist and oppositional movements in the second half of the 20th century and argue, and I'm giving you the basic arguments of my research because I think it will help you contextualize what I'm talking about, because I'm really just talking about one side of this multifaceted sort of negotiations and affairs that are going on. So, and I argue that within newly politicized urban spaces, minorities, such as the Assyrians, were attracted to intellectual and political movements that allowed them to emerge from the peripheries and advance issues that were beneficial to their community while engaging with the other Iraqis of their socioeconomic background and relying on transnational community networks influential during the Cold War period. So from the 1960s to the 1980s, and I stopped during the Anfal campaign, at the Anfal campaign. So in the 1960s, you have a lot of sort of leftist communist activity that the Assyrians are involved in. You have the Kurdish uprising that's starting off, and the Assyrians have a role in that as tribal leaders, as members of organizations, as villages who are joining against the centralized government in general. And then you have, in the 70s, you have urban intellectuals, you have cultural rights, that I'll talk about, and then you have the re-establishment of the Assyrian nationalist movement, which I'm not sure if Fadi agrees with me or not, but I call it the re-establishment because I think after the Semel period, it really, it halts. I mean, it's not what it used to be from the World War I period. And then again, the Iraqi opposition, which they become a part of on a political level. So as a result, Ba'athist policies towards the Assyrians reflected the regime's approaches to internal and external pressures exerted on it, and at times necessitated the state's attempt to attract Assyrian political and religious leaders with favorable policies such as cultural rights. So this is the region where the Assyrians live, basically northern Iraq, the modern countries that we have, northern Iraq and surrounding the Urmia, Iran region, you have southeast Turkey, and then you have the northwestern Syria as well. And there actually is intellectual discussion. There really is a transnational movement of music and of newspapers that are going back and forth. The communities, I mean, you have borders, but the communities are still engaged in various regards. The churches that they belong to, and the sources, I just list them to show you this is actually a challenge on working on Assyrians and minorities in the Middle East because we don't really have a central place where sources are collected. And maybe this is something that we can talk about as panelists at the end of the discussion, the Iraqi National Archives that I was at. Okay. And just a few words, Toma Tomas is a leader from Al-Qush. He was very active in the 1960s. This is a statue that's erected for him in 2007 in his village in Al-Qush that I was able to take. Margaret George, another active militant woman who joined from the Barwar region with her father and a few male figures from her village of Dure, joined the Iraqi opposition, the Kurdish opposition in the 60s. And Ba'athist archives, state archives that we have, clearly talking about how to Ba'athify society. On the other hand, we have state sources on the Assyrian nationalist movement from the 1980s. So they're talking about how are they getting together. This is a document that they have retrieved from the Assyrian movement, a pamphlet that was given up to villagers in the north that the government is talking about. And Mordana Aturaya is a magazine that I'll be discussing. So during the 1970s, Assyrian intellectuals promoted their culture and negotiated for political rights with the government, often framing their concerns using accepted Ba'athist narratives. Negotiation was a process in which Assyrians tried to understand themselves as a community and reach internal consensus, both within the ecclesiastical communities and between tribal, religious, and secular leaders. The community also negotiated by trying to position itself within Iraqi society in relation to both the state and the opposition, and also transnationally with the Assyrian Diaspora and Human Rights Organization. Eric Davis argues that savvy, non-elite or subaltern groups like the Assyrians began to subscribe to historical narratives propagated by the state to avoid provoking state authorities by expressing unauthorized ones. But memories propagated by the state were also challenged. The Assyrians, among other Iraqi communities, used counter-memory in their textual or oral productions to challenge the state's interpretation of the past. Assyrians, like other Iraqi intellectuals, were often successful in subverting the state's narratives by incorporating multiple layers of meaning into their texts to challenge a particular position propagated by the state. I highlight the Assyrian intellectual production by analyzing press and popular culture to understand how Assyrian intellectuals negotiated their own interest and related to a state growing in strength and influence, relying on influential publications such as Mordana Aturaya that you see, a cover of one of its magazines. Mordana Aturaya was published by the Assyrian Cultural Club from 1972 to 1985. And it's an excellent case study because it was published once every 3 months. It really high quality of articles in it. It was published mainly in Arabic and Aramaic, and you had intellectuals from various churches, Chaldean, Church of the East, mainly contributing to it. And not only from Baghdad. I mean, you had contributors from Baghdad, from Kirkuk, from Basra, from other provinces. You had people writing to the editors from Lebanon, from Chicago, various places. There was 2,000 copies published every 3 months, and the quantity depended on the financial situation of the club. And of course, the government restricted them from raising how much it costs to publish, the cost of the magazine. So they were dealing with certain cases where they could not publish more. But 2,000 copies was a significant number. And in 1984, when the magazine is really just a shadow of its former self, the editor tells us that we sent 500 copies to the US, or to North America rather, and we don't charge. I mean, they're just sent sort of as a gift to them. So I will be focusing on this magazine and the narratives of integration used in this particular magazine. In 1972, the promulgation of Law 251 by the government extended cultural and linguistic rights to the Assyrians, which officially they were referred to by the government as the Syriac-speaking citizens. The preface to the law asserted, I can talk about the song later. So basically, just one quick moment. So I talked about how there's negotiation. When in press, they're more careful in what they word and what terminology they used. But here's an example in the same club, the Assyrian Culture Club, where the magazine is published, where this is the first record we have of the Assyrians talking about the Simel massacre, which Fadi just talked about in 1933, of the community inside the country. And this is a song. Basically, a young high school graduate who becomes very famous after the song sings it in Aramaic. So what you say, what you sing about is different from what you write about in popular culture. Okay, so let's go back to Law 251. I'm not going to read it, but what's important here is the terminology. So the government gives them these rights, cultural rights, to the Syriac-speaking citizens, and just notice the terminology that they use. So when national minorities, the law states, al-aqalliyat al-qawmiyya, so they refer to them as an aqalliyya qawmiyya. By the end of the 70s, this changes, right? They become a ta'ifa. A denomination. You know, so the terminology is really important, and it's interesting how the Ba'ath regime frames that we're giving you these rights because you're sort of part of the democratic process, and you are a national minority deserving to be able to practice your cultural rights. So the law permitted the teaching of the Syriac language in primary and secondary schools where Assyrians were in majority, and also at the University of Baghdad's College of Art and Literature. A special television and radio program in Syriac was to be broadcast in Baghdad, Kirkuk, and Nineveh, cities with large concentrations of Assyrians. While Assyrian writers and academics were to be supported in various ways and represented in Iraqi cultural associations. Finally, the establishment of civil society organizations in the pursuit of social, cultural, artistic, and linguistic objectives was now explicitly permitted. So they're able to form organizations and publish more freely. A lot of these did not materialize, so yes, you do have organizations, forms, and publishing. The schools, they did not really extend the teaching of Syriac to schools, so this was just sort of symbolically passed, but they were not allowed to do so. They do have radio programs in Baghdad and Kirkuk, and so certain things were passed on, others were just basically cast aside. Following the passage of Law 251, Assyrians were cautiously optimistic about the cultural rights granted by the government. In the first half of the 1970s, they negotiated for rights within a Ba'athist system, constructing a historical narrative that integrated themselves into the social fabric of Iraqi society since Abbasid times. Assyrian communists used more modernist theoretical conceptions, drawing on socialism and Marxism to argue for Assyrian rights within the current system, a function of the temporary alignment between the Ba'ath and the Iraqi Communist Party, the ICP at the time. During this period, Assyrian intellectuals celebrated these policies, but probed the system by pushing its boundaries while maintaining their support for Ba'athism, at times superficially, and integrating Ba'athist principles to justify cultural and political rights for their community. The regime, for its part, temporarily engaged in reconciliatory practices, pursuing policies that drew the community closer to it and worked on implementing laws that projected it favorably in the West and meanwhile penetrated Assyrian institutions. So again, this is in the urban centers. In the non-urban centers, in the northern provinces especially, you do have an opposition. So this is why it's important for the Ba'ath regime to actually negotiate and give cultural rights, makes it look good internally and also externally. Some scholars argue that the Baathification of society did not begin until the Iraq-Iran war in 1980. My research supports this position, but points to a change of state policy towards the Assyrians and perhaps all Iraqis living in the northern provinces following the Algiers Agreement of 1975, and particularly in 1978 in Baghdad and other urban centers. The Algiers Agreement mended relations between Iraq and Iran, temporarily ending Iranian support for the Iraqi opposition, of which Assyrians were active within. So once the opposition became less significant, you see a shift in Ba'athist policies. So the cultural rights become less important and the negotiation sort of changes. There's a change of tone that you see, as I said, in the cities, urban centers in 1978, but in the rural center, really you see it much earlier, right after the Algiers Agreement is passed in 75. So this presentation therefore complicates the traditional scholarly view of the Ba'ath regime, which often presents Iraqi society under the Ba'ath as being closed and authoritarian, with a system with limited space for interaction between state and society. And it shows that the Ba'ath regime basically played politics at the beginning, at least in the early 70s. Narratives of integration. So the Iraqi government supplemented legislative policies with financial assistance to Assyrian culture organizations. Mordana Turaya became the beneficiary of a large donation from the Ministry of Information, Wazarat al-I'lam, and the Union of Iraqi Scholars. Government agencies also engaged the community by facilitating international academic conferences that featured classical Syriac intellectuals and invited Western scholars to participate. In February 1973, a festival was organized to honor Saint Ephraim, a 4th century hymnographer and theologian of the school of Nisibis, and Hunayn bin Ishaq, which we've talked about, who died in 873-877, who was a physician, translator, and active within the House of Wisdom during the Abbasid period. The men were described by the magazine as prominent intellectuals in the field of translation, composition, and service to humanity, somewhat downplaying Ephraim's role as a saint of the church. And this was held by the Ministry of Higher Education and Scientific Inquiry under the supervision and organization of Mujma' al-Lugha Suryaniya. Shamshan Kassou, the author of the article, characterized this conference as an embodiment of the cultural rights granted to the community by the Revolutionary Council. The Revolutionary Council had dedicated over 10,000 dinars, which roughly, I think at that time, in the 70s, a dinar was equivalent to $3 or so, to cover the expenses of the festival, which was a significant first step in demonstrating to the community the practical outcome of its policies. Shamshan Kassou briefly described the significance of these two historical figures in paving the way for the emergence and advancement of an intellectual renaissance. This renaissance had contributed to the emanation of Islamic civilization, which in turn had influenced world civilization, according to him. Here, Shamshan Kassou departed from this general historical background of Saint Ephraim and Hunayn bin Ishaq, contextualizing these historical figures in contemporary affairs. So he states, the emergence of the Arab state and the spread of its influence in Central Asia following the fall of the Persian Empire was an important factor in granting the Church of the East safety, peace, and security during that period. In the era of the rightly guided caliphs, the Church of the East gained recognition so that its Christian citizens, muwatineen, followers, could enjoy their full national rights, حقوقهم الوطنية. I mean, he's talking about the medieval period and he's using this kind of terminology, within the auspices of the state, or dawla, and its official protection. Shamshan Kassou used modern political terminology that defined the relations between state and society, citizenship and national rights, to construct a narrative of inclusion and plurality between the Assyrian community and the ruling authority from medieval to modern times. He indirectly equated the current Ba'athist administration to the rightly guided caliphs of the Golden Age of Islam. During this time, the Ba'ath regime was itself propagating a historical memory that fused Mesopotamianism with Iraq's Abbasid Islamic heritage, and at the same time demonstrating support for Pan-Arabism. Shamshan Kassou embedded the Assyrians within a historical narrative that catered to Arab nationalism with an emphasis on the Abbasid past. Within this discourse, Kassou highlighted the intellectual contribution of Assyrians to Islam and humanity, framing Assyrians as an integral native component of the country, deserving of full rights and citizens, full national rights as citizens. The Abbasid discourse was addressed in succeeding issues as well, where Assyrians appropriated Ba'athist language, celebrating the Abbasid period of the Golden Age of Islam. For instance, in the Assyrians in Abbasid time, Sliwu highlighted the collaboration between the Assyrians and the incoming Arab armies during the Islamic conquest of Mesopotamia. Again, he constructs this sort of narrative where the Assyrians escaped the clutches of the Byzantine forces, and although they're welcomed into Persia and allowed to join the church or function in the church, their situation does not improve until the Arab conquest 2 centuries later. And then he addresses the Abbasid Caliphate again and how it included the Assyrians as members of the community of court physicians, translators, and so on. Again, illustrating efforts of the Assyrian intellectuals to highlight the history of their community during the Abbasid period for the purpose of integrating their narrative within the officially recognized narrative. The international conference, focusing on Saint Ephraim and Hunayn bin Hishaq, deployed accepted narratives and exemplified what was permissible according to Law 251. The amount of money spent on the conference was significant, even by today's standards, and reflected the scale of cultural projects the government was engaged in. This investment was potentially beneficial to the state in two ways. First, the conference attracted important Western scholars with whom interviews appeared in Murdana Turaya. This was important because the Kurdish opposition, which included Assyrians, was actively seeking international support in its campaign against the Iraqi state. The presence of Western scholars and publicity could assist the newly founded Ba'ath state in portraying itself in a positive light, especially given the conference's emphasis on Christian minorities. Second, the government was actively seeking this support and indeed pursuing the co-optation of the Assyrian community. This conference sought to demonstrate to the community that the regime was willing to implement Law 251 and promote the Syriac language and culture. How many more minutes? Okay, so I will finish here. So this is something that's happening in Baghdad. I mean, there's other examples of Kirkuk where they have a conference where they are celebrating the revolution of the anniversary of the revolution, whereas the revolution of the Ba'athist regime, of course, the Ba'athist revolution. Whereas if you look at the contents of the program, I mean, they have singers singing Rujwanqa, Awaken, O Youth, which is a national song from the 1920s, right? They have performers who are outplaying the song. And you have a lot of other speakers who sort of, if you know their background and you've read their writings from previous periods, from previous years, you know that they're really just paying lip service to the Ba'athist regime. So it's really interesting how intellectuals sort of know what the parameters are, but they still try to shift and negotiate and use terminology that's accepted and use language which is frames this law. So it's a way of allowing themselves to insert themselves in this narrative, to push the boundaries while still sort of maintaining the boundaries and not being, seriously affected. And we know that by the end of the 70s, a lot of this shifts and changes. Murdana Turaya, the way the magazine cover, which incorporated Assyrian art, for example, from ancient to modern periods, changes, and it becomes, you see pictures of Saddam Hussein, you see pictures of the war efforts, and this tone of negotiation and resistance that you found in the early 70s sort of disappears in the late 70s, and especially in the 80s. In the Assyrian sections, you read poems sometimes and you say to yourself, well, there must be a lot of multiple layers of meaning here. There's a lot of symbolism here. But that engagement of intellectuals that you found in the 70s, you do not find again in the 1980s. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Benjamin. Our next speaker, Eden Nabi, is a cultural historian of the Middle East and Central Asia who has moved from studying Middle East religious and ethnic minorities to focusing on the modern Assyrians, particularly on issues of cultural preservation. Among her many articles on Assyrians are the key introduction to Assyrians in the former Soviet Union, the use of the pre-World War I Assyrian periodical press to analyze Assyrian cultural progress, 1977 and 2006, and her work at the Foundation for Endangered Languages and the Encyclopedia Iranica. Her books include Afghanistan, Mullah, Marx, and Mujahid, and the forthcoming Assyrians of the Middle East.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming. I know this is the last presentation, so try to stay awake. The preservation of Aramaic through music and word needs a little bit of introduction with regard to the background of the cultural development of the Assyrians in the modern period. So up to the 1850s, the life of the Assyrian community was largely built around their church communities, their villages, and the main mode of sustenance, economic sustenance, was agriculture. In some areas, this was sustenance, bare sustenance. And so there was an interest in going abroad for work because there were certain kinds of employment that were closed to Assyrians as they were to the Jews. So the Assyrians began their first cross-border migrations toward Russia, the Tsarist Russia, and there was a lot of there were a lot of people who went there for seasonal work, as did Armenians. Other Assyrians, particularly among the Chaldean community, were involved in the age-old, millennia-old, as we see, pattern of trade across various borders, usually not long-distance trade, but short-distance trade. And these continued to be the way that the pre-modern Assyrians led their lives, their economic lives, and their social lives. However, as many of you know, the presence of American and British missionaries that we've referred to, and American missionaries in particular, made a profound difference in the question of language preservation and the commitment of the vernacular dialect to the written word and the printed word. With the coming of the American missionaries in northwest Iran in particular, we have the beginning of schools that are secular schools conducted in the language that is spoken by the Assyrians. Some of this activity was also undertaken by French missionaries, both in northern Iraq, in Mosul and in those areas, as well as in the Urmi area of northwest Iran, and especially Salamis. However, despite all the strength of represented by this resurgence of support from abroad, and to some extent the remunerations that were sent from those who went to work, first in Russia and then in the United States in particular, despite all of this, the entire Assyrian progress in culture and education was totally destroyed by the genocide of the First World War, to be followed by the smaller incident, but significant politically, far just as much, of Semele in 1933. With genocide, displacement, and immigration, 2/3 of the population of the Assyrians was lost to conversion, murder, starvation, and flight. Most were forbidden to return to their homelands. It's especially true in Iran, because in Iran, the Assyrians had a strong claim to the Urmi area, and our two speakers referred in part to some of the reasons why, but they were prevented from returning to Iran. In some cases, I know some of you have experience of families having to change their names from Assyrian to Armenian in order to be able to return to Iran. In diaspora, then, which now includes over half of the world Assyrian population, especially with the most recent devastation in Mesopotamia. Economically, the Assyrian community, we can say, is thriving now. There are many professionals. There are many people who are carving out lives that are economically stable. But culturally, the community is starving. As one of the leading proponents of cultural advancement has said recently, that our community, the Assyrians, because of their constant refugee status from the 1920s, where they emerge, they educate, they establish themselves, and then in the 40s comes another surge of immigrants and refugees, and so on, in the 1960s in particular, in the 80s. So there is this constant feeding of the community and distraction of the community for economic advancement away from cultural facilities. So the economic strength now is fairly well developed, not as much as some of their neighbors, and certainly there are no resources, state resources, to support this, as in the case of many of the other minorities in the Middle East. But culturally, the Assyrian community in diaspora, and the biggest communities I think currently are probably Australia and North America, as well as Northern Europe. Sweden and the Scandinavian countries, Finland, are fairly strong now because there is a considerable amount of social and cultural support there from the state. In the US, there isn't. So there is a cultural weakness, language loss, loss of creativity in arts and literature in particular, lack of familiarity with their own modern history due to Middle Eastern school education. So some of them were educated in Aramaic, in Iran, in Iraq, in Syria, and then these schools were closed. In Iran, they're not closed, but they're extremely restricted since the 1980s. So there is also the outsider distortion of history of the Assyrians. There is a far greater focus on church divisions in the Assyrian community, various patriarchates, than there is on the factors that unite Assyrians, which is their language and their historical narrative. The rise of nationalisms, as Alda has said, or was it you, Fadi? Nationalisms in the Middle East in the post-World War II period meant that there is non-recognition of Assyrian ethnicity, and I think Alda and Fadi have both spoken to this very well, only recognition of the church institutions. Now, I say except Iran, I don't mean that Iran is exceptionally good in this regard, but there is some difference between how Iran and the rest of the Middle East regards the Assyrians in terms of ethnicity. The churches are not active in promoting the living language, but mainly Syriac. Syriac is an Aramaic language, and sometimes I wasn't very clear in this conference. It is an Aramaic language developed in Orhai, but it is now a liturgical language. It's not a spoken language. It is the language of the chants in all of the Assyrian churches. Imagine if Old Church Slavonic continued to be taught in the Slavic language areas rather than the living language. So the living language, in fact, is suffering at the expense of the teaching of Syriac in the churches. The Ba'athist regime in Syria also forced closed Assyrian schools, which had been doing relatively well in places like Qamishli. Iraq had functioning schools on the Nineveh Plain, mainly supported by the diaspora, using the books of Kurish Benjamin, who is a relative of one of our panelists, yes, and reprinted from Iran. The Syrian Orthodox Church actively discouraged the literary production of Suryoyo or Turoyo, which is the Western language that is used in the community. The spoken and written language today are largely based on the works of Iranian Assyrians. Now, I don't say that only because I come from the Urmi region. I say it because the education of Assyrians in Iran and their vernacular language was far stronger and less restricted in the last 50 years than anywhere else in the Middle East. So there is a great reliance on the works of Assyrians from Iran for the poetry that exists today, for the plays, and for the histories, the anthologies, and so forth, even though Urmi was not the first place where the vernacular was committed to writing. It was, in fact, in Al-Qush, about which my colleagues have spoken. Schools, however, in Iran have had a rocky history. The Friday language schools, Friday being the Muslim holiday, was when we studied primary level vernacular in church schools and also in secular schools, such as in Hamadan in the 1930s, in Abadan in the 1950s and 60s, in Urmi, and most importantly in Tehran. And I think we have several people in this room who are actually graduates from the very important school in Tehran. In the 1960s, the work of the Sita Sapreta Alamaya Aturai Tehran, which is the youth organization of Assyrians of Tehran, became extremely significant in the promotion of literature and history and poetry, as well as performing arts. Catholic schools have continued to teach languages in some areas that I'm speaking about, but the Protestant schools, which had been so strong in the late 19th and pre-diaspora period, have collapsed because in 1961 the Protestant churches simply pulled out of that sort of thing. From words to music means that the attention of Assyrians, the ability to support a wide range of culture, was extremely limited. So for a long period of time, the people who retained the language, the poetry, the music, were popular singers. And here I'm calling them wedding singers, just because that's a popular term that's used in Greek and Jewish culture. But in fact, these are people who would perform at entertainments, they would New Year's celebrations and so forth. And they would sing songs that related to patriotism, rather than simply, I love you, you are my love, and so forth and so on. There was that too. But interspersed in all of this was a great deal of patriotic poetry and patriotic music, some of it written by the performers themselves. This particular gentleman, born in Baghdad, 1949, Asher Betsargas, is probably the best known and best loved of the persons in this category of Assyrian singers, who are still revered, I would say, because of the role they have played in retaining patriotism. Art songs, compositions from the 19th century, are mainly lost, mainly due to the diaspora and the fact that preservation methods were simply not there as we have them in the post-World War I period. Some of the early 78 RPMs recorded are often from the diaspora, dealing with themes of nationalism in some instances history, and in some instances plain love songs, but all in the Aramaic language. Poetry, theater, and the performing arts preservation have been difficult, as I have been saying, but we do have some anthologies of poetry from the late 19th and 20th century, not much, but these have been preserved in a book by Sarmas, to which the fundamental book on Assyrian literature and poetry, the book by Rudolf Matsur, 1975, I think, is based in large respect. Before World War I, the Assyrians in Iran had 4 periodicals, the earliest being in 1849, which is the earliest periodical published anywhere in Iran. And in Ottoman Turkey, there were 2, and Fadi referred to one of them, I think. And Georgia, there was 1 because of this migration from Urmi, especially, to Russia, Tsarist Russia. And then that's about it before World War I. After World War I in the Middle East and diaspora, there were many, many Assyrian publications in the United States, short-lived, not institutionally supported. And I was hoping, and I know that the Library of Congress has a lot of these periodicals, but they're very precious, and so they're not in that room for display. But really, they are wonderful, and a wonderful collection exists here. There are also church publications, so these tend to be in the native language, but in diaspora, they have to adopt other languages as well. So they are often bilingual, sometimes trilingual, because of the immigration, especially with Arabic. And in the Middle East itself, too, they are tending to be more and more bilingual, in part because there are fewer and fewer people who actually can write in these languages, in the Aramaic language, and also because of the fact that their readership requires it, and there is state censorship that requires national language use. Now, the rise of theatrical and performing arts is an interesting one, and I've written at least one article that's specifically about that in Iran. But we have the rise of theater performance in Tehran, in Baghdad, and in Qamishli. Qamishli, all of you know, is in eastern Syria. In the United States, because of the large diaspora following the genocide, we have performances of plays by non-professionals, members of the community, social groups, and so on. Especially along the East Coast, we have some wonderful, wonderful pictures from that period where they performed things like Arshin Malalan, which is an Azeri Turkish play that's very popular, made into film 4 times at least, in Chicago and in the Central Valley in the 1950s. In the USSR, the former Soviet Union, there was considerable state sponsorship of Assyrian cultural activity. This is because the language of the Assyrians was recognized as one of the nationality languages of the Soviet Union. It came without territoriality, but where there were large clusters, as in Armenia and in Georgia, they had schools of their own which were sponsored by the state. With the end of the Soviet Union, that kind of sponsorship has ended, and the community in Russia and in the Transcaucasus is active, but not as active as before. So in our time now, in the last 20 years, Europe and Australia and the United States have become refugee locations, but state sponsorship of Assyrian activity, cultural activity, is very, very limited. So the community has to depend on itself, on its own resources, in order to raise the funds to be able to perform, to create any kind of cultural performance. The content of the plays, as I said, from Arshin Malalan is an example. We also have examples of adaptations of Russian material. And we have original skits, plays, based on Assyrian historical events. A lot of this is not fully documented, but there's a good deal of material on it that we have published in some of the Assyrian organization magazines, such as the Assyrian Star, and these are available. Choral and solo singing of art songs, especially in Tehran, became very popular. The inspiration from music, my eye is over there, the inspiration for music is incorporation of Assyrian traditional melodies to Western instruments. So the 3 leading figures for this kind of activity are all from Iran, and as you will see from this chart, 2/3 have emigrated and died in the West. So what is happening then is that we know, for example, that Assyrian music in the ancient period had certain instruments that are depicted or known, and there are some discussion of it, but there's also some music from the ancient period that's performed. So what happens is that when we have Assyrian affairs, then we have, say, a harp substituting for what would have been an ancient Assyrian instrument. My emphasis for a bit of this talk is going to be on the Mesopotamian Night event, which is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year out of San Jose. Mesopotamian Night is an organization that tries to have, through sheer volunteer activity, Assyrian events that include both popular and new music. Mesopotamian Night draws on the works of people that I've named here, composers and poets, and they also commission new music and new poetry. I guess we're not going to have a sample of the music, but this is one example of the event that took place in San Jose, and it's now taking place, this annual event is also in Chicago and in Los Angeles, hopefully also in Phoenix, if you guys work pretty hard. This is how some of the work is done. It's fairly professional. Expansion, and then there is the updating of popular songs through orchestral accompaniment. and sometimes dance. Sometimes this is a real flop, but sometimes it works very well. But the future direction. My particular interest over the next few years is in the Assyrian Arts Institute, a new organization which is very, very different from the older organizations because it is committed to being an institutionalized, endowed structure. Endowed is the key word. And the commitment is to promoting language, promoting awareness of Assyrian arts, and promoting performance. Other promising directions, there is a new poetry organization between Cambridge University and the Journal of Assyrian Academic Studies, a collaboration that is being engineered and fostered by one of our current young poets, Nina Blamasu. And there are new attempts to institute schools in Australia and the United States. But with every generation of refugees, and the debate over whether Assyrians should actually remain in the Middle East or not, we have the resources, the financial resources of the Assyrian community being drawn away from might have been gone into cultural things into dealing with refugees. And that is the sad part of our history. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nabi. We have a few minutes for question and answer. There's two people in this room here. This gentleman.
Thank you, Dr. Dawood. From the beginning of today, we heard from the history of the dawn of civilization to today. And it seems to me that recently, the world has become very messy, violent, whereas before every 200 years or so there was genocide or something. Now we have every 5-10 years. Has anybody done any study as far as what's the future holds? Is this trend going to continue, or why is it?
I don't think anyone has done any studies on the future and what it holds, but maybe my co-panelist.
I didn't understand the question.
I mean, he's asking if there are any studies done on the future of the Syrian community.
Well, studies can't be done on the future, but speculation can be made, and there is a great deal of dissent in the community about just what should be done with the community, because the future of the community in the Middle East is in peril. And there are many important voices in the diaspora community who are saying, let's not put those $2 million a year into supporting those communities. Let us use that money to support communities and bring them out here, out to where they can actually live in some security. So that is the discussion, but I don't know that you would call that a study.
Can I also add, there's different voices. You have what people in the diaspora want, what people in Iraq or the homeland want, and sometimes they are not aligned. Through my travels, I think a lot of them want to remain in Iraq if they can. So they do hold on. Like I said, in Al-Qush, when we went up to Rabban Hurmus Monastery from the mountain, it was evening. You could see ISIS. I mean, they told me, you see those red lights over there? And I said, what are you doing? I mean, how do you sleep at night? But they love their village, they love their town, they are proud of their history, and they want to remain. So, I mean, so there's different aspects of, there's so many narratives that are going on. But there are some studies done on language. For example, the Aramaic language. And the fear is that within 2 generations or so, it ceases to exist in the diaspora. So, if you have a family that speaks Aramaic, their children might speak it, their grandchildren might speak it, but then after that, so you have studies like that on certain aspects of the culture. And there's a lot of fear. If you lose the people in the homeland and the language and the roots that they had, the connections they had to the land and the language, then what happens to us? And it goes back to what Dr. Eden Nabi is saying, do we start focusing more on on the community here, because every wave of refugees basically drains the efforts and the finances of the community to helping refugees, and you've been dealing with that often, so you can't focus on building schools and on contributing to arts and so on and so forth. So it's a dilemma.
Wonderful lecturers. Thank you very much. Very, very touched by all three of them. Professor Dawood, I have a question for you. At the time when we were talking about the religious, the religious factor, the third factor, and the nationalism that was happening, was there a distinction at that point between the Chaldani Chaldeans or the Assyrians? Had it happened? Was this a later phenomenon? I'm just curious, when you said about bringing together everyone Christian or Aramaic speaking, was it the entire Aramaic Christian speaking part of Iraq, or was it just the Assyrians?
Well, interestingly, Agapatras, in his letters and his correspondence, which I write about, says, I will represent all the population, the Chaldo-Assyrians, in sort of brackets, while Surma Shamoun is only interested in her community of the Nestorians. Now, it's a complicated issue because those who, for example, lived in Mosul did not identify with this community. They identify as Arab, but part of the Syriac Orthodox tradition, or Syriac Catholic tradition, or Chaldean tradition. Those who, same Syriac Orthodox members who were living in Tur Abdin, identified strongly with this Assyrian nationalist phenomenon, and actually were producing a lot of the narrative that was actually bringing this to the forefront of the intellectual debate. Now, are there divisions? Absolutely. And even the ideas of these communities and who do they belong to, etc., it exists. But it did not really become as entrenched, I think, as it did after the Simele massacre, when most of the urbanites said, hold on a second, we have nothing to do with these people living in the villages. We have nothing to do with this, with these troublemakers, because they wanted to survive, essentially. They wanted to politically survive in a state that was becoming increasingly more hegemonic. And so that's why it's sort of, you see it's periods of division, and sort of these things change with violence, with acts of genocide, with acts of massacres, and yet when the state sort of embraces them, everybody's embracing each other. I find it really interesting that in the diaspora, these are actually a lot less pronounced to a certain year, because there are no pressures like that.
Can I also add? I mean, in my period, I see changes already, right? So, I mean, I think in your period, and Fadi, I do have a document from, I think, 1919, from Mosul, where the patriarch is writing to the British, and he's saying, I represent the ancient Assyrian community, and he's from the Syriac Orthodox Church.
Don't forget, the person that actually goes to represent the Syrians at the peace talks is a Syriac Orthodox bishop who becomes a patriarch. And suddenly, when he becomes a patriarch, with the influence of the Syrian and the Iraqi state, he becomes an Arab. So you see that shift, and actually, if you read I think the book in Arabic is called Al-Lu'lu' al-Mubathara, the scattered pearl.
It has an English translation.
Does it have an English? Okay.
Yes.
So it has an English. You see, you know, he's an Assyrian nationalist in that book, and suddenly that shifts and changes. So I think really that the hegemony of the Iraqi state plays a big role on this.
So for my period, post-Simele, I see there's disintegration. For my period, there's a lot of involvement in leftist politics. There's the urbanization. The community is not urbanized until the 1950s or so. That's when if you look at census records and so, they're urbanizing, they're living together, they're politicizing together, they're intermarrying. You have the dialect that's sort of like fusing together more so, and these distinctions are not important. You know, I mean, Toma Tamas, I showed him his picture. He's from Al-Qush, he's a Chaldean, but if you read his memoirs, he calls this town an ancient Assyrian town, and he does identify as an Assyrian. You know, it's in his memoirs. And the Mordana al-Turaya, there was a lot of writers, important writers, who were from Al-Qush, who were Chaldean. So the religious identities in the second half of the 20th century is not as important. But then, after 2003, I think you have a lot of sectarianism in the country, and it affects the community as well.
Well, let me just add a very short note to that the root of all of this identity with church as opposed to an ethnic group goes back to the millet system of the Ottoman Empire. If the Ottoman Empire only recognized a group as a church community rather than as an ethnic group, then it was very difficult for that ethnic group to emerge as a viable institutional force in any level. And that Ottoman legacy continues throughout the Middle East. It affected Iran less, but somewhat. But it is true in Turkey today, it's true in all of the Middle East. And this recognition of the community through its church, through its confession, is what is crippling the nationalist movement in the Assyrians.
Thank you. Thank all of you for your presentations. They were great. And to the folks from AUA for helping put this together. This really is a triumph for our people, and we're really proud of all of you. I have a question for Dr. Nabi, particularly about, you brought up Malik Rama, which was a really beautiful thing that our community did.
What brought up what? I didn't understand.
Malik
Speak
Rama.
Assyrian. What?
Oh. you brought up Malik Rama, like the opera. There are a lot of sort of institutional resources when it comes to the arts. The Washington National Opera just closed the Ring Cycle, for example. And this is a largely taxpayer-funded endeavor. Has the Assyrian community, or can the Assyrian community, use these national endowments through organizations like the Kennedy Center, like the Washington National Opera, to put on, to sort of bring our opera, our literature, our poetry to that national stage? Because it seems like it would work on that sort of large scale, and there is a precedent for it in terms of the WNO, for example, bringing sort of smaller operettas to this audience. And I'm just curious if that's something that has been pursued or could potentially be pursued.
I think part of the problem in our approach to culture, where we have had even minimal funds to do it, is that we feel that we must and can only work within our own community. I think this is a legacy of the past in the Middle East, where we've been so confined that we haven't been allowed to enter into a national culture. But yes, in the United States it's possible, yes, and I have high hopes for the Assyrian Arts Institute, which I think is not only going to be quite well funded, but it also has as part of its vision to enter into collaboration with other parts of states, institutions, state organizations and festivals, and as well as on the national level, yes. But so far, we haven't received any funds, let's say, from the National Endowment for the Arts or the Humanities and such. Yes, but only on a minor scale.
So I have two questions for you. They're somewhat interrelated. One, I want to thank all three of you for the wonderful presentations. One of the things that we've noticed in the Assyrian community and the diaspora is the rise of nationalism amongst the youth. But at that same time, we've also noticed a loss of the actual Aramaic language. What do you think contributes to that? And what are the steps at helping grow the nationalism while at the same time encouraging the preservation of the language?
Well, since preservation was my theme, let me address that very briefly and then see if my colleagues have anything to say about it. I think if we look at other diaspora communities, let's say Armenian, which is very close to us, or I dare say even in the future, the Persian community. What's happened? Did you cut me off? That if we look at other immigrant communities that are our neighbors from the Middle East and suffer from some of the same psychological problems that we have, not reaching out, that we will see that language plays a very important role in identity, but language is not the only criteria. its narrative. I mean, how many people in the, let's say, even the most recent Persian community speak Persian well enough so that they can read the Shahnameh? Very few. But that doesn't mean they are excluded by the other Iranians, or it shouldn't mean, from being part of that community. One of the problems in the Assyrian community with the waves and waves of immigrants and the difference in dialects is that we have said whoever isn't speaking my dialect isn't Assyrian. All right, it's a very foolish way of looking at nationalism. And I would say that if we are going to exclude, as they have in the past in the 1960s, all the children of the old immigrants were virtually driven out of every Assyrian organization because there was a new surge of Assyrians coming from the Middle East who spoke the language, didn't speak English, but they spoke the language, and that's what happened. So we are throwing out people for no reason, even though they are Assyrian. And this is what is happening to our community. It's a problem in the Armenian community, too. That is language the only basis for understanding who you are? I maintain it's not. So even though we should make efforts to keep the language, it's not the only criteria.
I will direct my question to Dr. Eden, but before that, I just want to say something. When I entered this building and made my way through all those the hallways here, I was mesmerized and fascinated by all the mosaic art on the ceiling and the paintings on the wall. My thoughts went back all the way to the ancient time, and I almost imagined myself walking in Ashurbanipal's library, the library of our ancestors. So I can only imagine it was as magnificent as this building is. My question to you is, you mentioned something about the establishment of the Assyrian schools in Tehran and Salamis. Do those schools still exist there?
In Salamis, it was before World War I, so no. Salamis was devastated by Kurdish and Turkish fighters completely. I mean, there's hardly any people left, any Assyrians left in the Salamis area. The Tehran school functions, but it was extremely limited through the constitutional changes that occurred with the establishment of the Islamic Republic. So yes, it exists, but it limps. Sorry.
At this point, I'd like to ask all the panelists to come forward because we're going to take a picture together. And thank you all for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.